I know there's a big push for grass-fed beef, and there are two good arguments for that. One really boils down to the fact that ruminants have an important, really important part in the food chain, because the cattle can, they all kind of disappeared. Cattle can come out and graze on pasture like this and convert the cellulosic material into high quality protein. We can't do that. We eat this grass, it just goes straight through us. We may extract a few nutrients, but the bacteria and protozoans in the rumen of cattle and sheep and goats, they convert that to very high quality protein. And so the argument, one good argument for pasture feeding is, this is a great way to take this biomass that we can't use and convert it to very good quality protein. And I'm a biologist, I couldn't agree more with that. And if you have good pasture, you get good rain, from an economic standpoint, it makes good sense. Background your cattle on pasture. If you can afford it, you've got good pasture. Well, this is how, cattle producers don't make much money. They're living on margins. If they've got good pasture and they can background cattle on that, well, that's what they should be doing. The problem with keeping cattle on pasture for the duration of their production lifespan is that it imparts some different flavors, which the American population, most people really don't favor, and it does change the fatty acid composition. So there are factors in grains that we feed in feedlots that actually cause the fat to become less saturated. So the fat cells make more oleic acid, the fat becomes softer, and we find it more pleasant, more pleasant flavor and mouthfeel. And so there's some positive benefits of that. It doesn't have quite as greasy a mouthfeel. I guess my biggest problem with pasture, or this grass-fed movement, is when they do what I used to do and come out and say, well, our beef is healthier. Well, I used to say, oh, corn-fed or Wagyu beef is healthier, but you've got to do the studies first. And the only study in this country that I'm aware of of any study that actually looked at LDL cholesterol levels, other risk factors, was a study that we did, that one funded by the Beef Checkoff, that said, well, if you take cattle that never saw any grain and cattle that saw grain and you raise them to 20 months of age, that the grass-fed, it's not unhealthy, but it's certainly not healthier for you. And I think that's what people need to understand, that, yeah, feed cattle. If people want to eat grass-fed beef, wonderful. The beef should have more markets open to it. That we should create lots of markets to satisfy consumers. And I'm all for, my father-in-law was an Angus feeder calf producer, and he taught me everything he knew, and, well, not everything he knew, just everything I knew, about a fraction of what he knew. But these guys are just barely making it, so anything you can do to increase your profitability, that's great. But once you start saying that this beef is healthier than that beef, then you're just making it easier for people who don't want beef on the plate to say, look, beef's unhealthy. Any kind of infighting like this just does a lot of damage to the beef cattle industry in general. Because of all the information we've had over the last few years on ground beef, from grass-fed cattle and grain-fed to choice or grain-fed to super choice, like in the Japanese cattle, we were able to make comparisons across those different production styles as to the fatty acid composition of ground beef that we produce from them. And if you look at, say, Akaushi or Wagyu, the Asian ground beef, I think a lot of people are familiar with the term Kobe. And Akaushi is just the red Wagyu, and they're very similar in composition. And what you see in ground beef, or all muscle foods from those animals, is that they're very high in oleic acid, and so that a ground beef patty might have, a quarter pounder might have 14 grams of oleic acid in it, and much less saturated fat and much less trans fat. Beef is a natural source of trans fat. The rumen does make trans fat. And there's research going on, is this good trans fat or is it bad trans fat? So right now we're still working on that. But we actually tried to measure trans fat in samples from Japanese cattle while I was in Australia. and they had no detectable trans fat. And this is a rumen thing. It's really weird. So it was really unusual. Really high oleic acid, low in saturated fat, zero trans fat. Well, we tend to see that if you take a Wagyu ground beef patty or akaushi, that high oleic acid, low trans fat, and lower saturated fat. At the other extreme is if you take cattle, and we have some data from Angus cattle, they're actually fed to choice on nothing but pasture. So these were older cattle. And so at one extreme, we had 14 grams of oleic acid per patty, only 6 grams of oleic acid per patty in the grass-fed cattle. And then something on the order of 15 grams of saturated fat. So it really flips. Grass feeding doesn't allow the enzyme that makes oleic acid to have any activity. We don't promote that. And so you wind up with a lot of saturated fat and very little oleic acid. And then, now, one thing that you can see from this bar graph, what I put in yellow at the very top is the amount of alpha-linolenic acid, or the N3 or omega-3 fatty acids, and you have to look pretty hard to find it. It's a small band of yellow that you can see on the bar for the grass-fed cattle, and it's there, but it's barely detectable in ground beef from cattle grain-fed to choice or from these akaushi or super prime cattle. So you definitely can get more omega-3 fatty acids in ground beef by grass feeding, but quantitatively, talk about a drop in the bucket, it's just a tiny amount. And so I am a firm believer in the health benefits of omega-3 fatty acids, particularly the marine fatty acids, which this is not, it's a different fatty acid. Beef just isn't a good source of them. You need a varied diet, which I'm all for, and get that get your omega-3s from different sources. Well, when we first started studying the effects of different production systems on the fatty acid composition of beef, one of the things we did, which you should do, is went back and looked at the older literature. And there was a wonderful study that came out some years ago from Jennifer Leheska, and worked with Fred Owens up at Oklahoma State. And they compared the fatty acid composition from grain-fed and grass-fed beef. And we looked at that work and said, well, grass feeding is increasing the total amount of trans fatty acids and saturated fatty acids. And it wasn't a huge difference, but we're going, wow, that's, I'm not sure that's what you really want. And yes, of course, you did increase omega-3 fatty acids, but again, it was a small increase. So as we started doing our study, that's one of the reasons why we did the study, the Beef Checkoff funded study. We used grass-fed beef and regular grain-fed and an extended grain-fed, not because we were trying to pick on grass-fed, but we learned from this previous research that if we wanted to get variation in fatty acid composition of beef, if we wanted to decrease oleic acid, let's feed them grass, keep them on pasture. If we want to increase oleic acid, well, the longer you feed grain, the fatter the cattle get, the more oleic acid is in the beef. And so we had 3 different levels of oleic acid and conversely 3 different levels of saturated fats and omega-3s. And so we were able to take advantage of that. And clearly it worked. We were able to, just by keeping cattle on pasture, that ground beef had more saturated fat, more trans fat, less oleic acid, and if we kept them on grain for a very long time, got them good and fat, well, they had more oleic acid, less trans, less saturated fat, and less omega-3s too. So we did have one group of animals that we didn't produce, but we sampled those for another producer. And these are cattle that were actually fed strictly on pasture until they reached choice, and which we've never been able to accomplish. We only get them up to about mid-select. But these cattle have been fed out, and so they did grade choice. We actually measured the fat in there, and it truly was choice. The thing about those cattle is when we measure the fatty acids, I have never seen such a low level of oleic acid in a beef sample. It was, instead of being over 50% of total fatty acids, it was less than a third. And then so the remainder, the other 2/3 of the fatty acids consisted of saturated fatty acids and trans fatty acids. So when you keep cattle on pasture for a very long period of time and try to feed them out to choice, then you wind up with a fat composition that may not be as desirable to consumers. Certainly the melting point of that fat was very high, and so the mouthfeel is going to be unpleasant to most people. Now, a lot of folks, when I talk about grass feeding versus grain feeding, I'll say, well, grass feeding increases saturated fats. They always ask what kind of grass. You know, here we are in Texas, some fescue, some coastal Bermuda grass. I'm sure that types of grass and forage make a big difference. You know, my family and I lived in Australia for 4.5 months, and this was back in mid-90s where the feedlot industry was really just taking off. Most of the beef we ate was off pasture, and it was wonderful. And I would say that probably better than their grain-fed at the time. So it didn't seem greasy. So yes, pastures, different kinds of pastures do have different effects on fat composition. But in general, as you look at the literature, all the publications that I review or read are showing that the longer cattle are on grain, the softer the fat. The longer they're on grass, the harder the fat, the more saturated fats. So if an animal product like lamb, we all love lamb too. You know, living in Australia, in Queensland, in Brisbane there, we ate a lot of lamb, but we had to eat the lamb while it was still hot. My wife would cook up a roast and the kids and I would all devour it, but we had to eat it very quickly. Lamb is naturally high in saturated fatty acids, a lot of palmitic and a whole lot of stearic acid, very high melting point. As soon as that starts to cool down from oven temperature, it hardens, and so it becomes very greasy. Now the flip side of that is we've been able to cook beef from Wagyu cattle. I do work with Wagyu, so I bring some home, and if you cook that roast up, as it cools down, it takes a long time for that fat to harden because it's much lower in saturated fat and much higher in oleic acid. And here's an experiment you can do at home. If you take some ground beef from grass-fed cattle and buy that, cook it in a pan, and then take some ground beef from Angus. And I say Angus because those cattle are going to be longer fed because they're feeding out to choice, so they're higher in oleic acid. So you cook the patties in 2 separate pans, and then watch what happens to the fat in the pan as that skillet cools down. Now, this doesn't work if you grill it. You got to catch the fat. But when you cook that grass-fed ground beef patty, that fat's going to become white, opaque, very quickly as the pan cools down because it's high in saturated fat, and saturated fat has a high melting point. You take the Angus beef, certified Angus beef, or just Angus ground beef, cook that, watch what happens with the fat, and it takes a long time for it to set up. And depending on how long the cattle were fed, it may not set up and become opaque at all. So melting point you can actually visualize at home, so you really can tell a difference in mouthfeel, in the greasiness, and that the amount of stearic acid, saturated fatty acids, do have a major impact on melting point. Now, trans fats are a whole different issue. Our cells don't make trans fats. We get trans fats either from hydrogenation of oils that they do chemically, and so they're trying to reduce trans fats in products. The reason that they hydrogenated fats chemically was to make it a solid at room temperature. They took corn oil and said, I'm going to make a stick of margarine out of this. Well, how do you make a stick of margarine out of an oil? So back when I was 11 or 12, Mom pulled butter off the counter and put margarine on the counter, and they were all bragging it was made of corn oil, Mazola, I believe, and they said, look, you're eating polyunsaturated fat. Didn't mention the fact that they had to hydrogenate that fat, get rid of those double bonds so that it would actually be a solid at room temperature. So as long as you have saturated fats or trans fats, they have a much higher melting point and they'll be a solid. Now, the amount of trans fat in most beef and dairy products is very, very low, and naturally. And some of the trans fat, one of the major ones, transvasenic acid, they've done some very nice studies in some laboratory studies, and they can't see any negative health effects. We don't know about all the trans fats that are in animal products, but we do know that the trans fats behave more like saturated fats. They have a double bond. It's called a trans double bond. It doesn't put a kink in the molecule, so it doesn't reduce the melting point. And so if you take a stick of margarine that was just made of transvasenic, if you could get that much transvasenic, it would be a solid at room temperature. I don't know what it would taste like. I've never had any such thing. But trans fats have higher melting points. It's your cis double bond like you have in oleic acid, in linoleic, linolenic. Those are going to lower the melting point.